Brett, thank you very much for inviting me to speak, to share my thoughts with you guys here this morning about sex and sexuality for black men, or for men. When I look around the room here this morning, I want you to just take a look around yourselves. Some of you have not maybe looked around since you've been here sitting down. I just want you to look around for a minute and see who's here. The ratio of men to women in the room right now is about 2 to 1. Okay? That is important because not only this is a men's conference, but one of the things that I subscribe and I imagine is also supported by research is that as men, we get our sense of self, of sex, of who we are, our sexuality, our sexual orientation, our masculinity from our women. If there has been a generational, a millennial misconception that women have allowed men to get away with, who do they say is often the power behind the throne? It's the woman, the mother, the wife. Who is it that we men look to shape our sense of self so that we can understand our sexuality, our manhood, what it means to be man? Who do we look to for that? Our mothers. Isn't it always said as well that the bond between a mother and son is one of the strongest bonds? And why is that so? Because the mother shapes the son. Very often, however, that gets screwed up because the mother can shape the son into the man that she would have wanted, or into the man that she expected, or into the man who was in her life but is no longer, and she felt betrayed, so she wants to correct that man in her son. But you know, we say you make a child, but you don't make a child's mind, right? Okay. Just a couple of quick definitions. We've got sex, which is, by definition, what is sex? Precisely. And that starts in your mother's womb. That starts with the setting up of the chromosomes, the X and the Y chromosomes. That's where it starts setting up. That starts setting up the formation of your genitalia. That starts setting up the portion on the hypothalamus that determines the hormones that are going to control you or not. The testosterone if you're male, the estrogen if you're female. Okay? And how those play into regulating your entire endocrine system. All right? Good. But we also have sex, which is the physical act that we engage in, which is also very important, whether we do it by ourselves or we do it with someone else. So sex is also a very important motivating and driving factor in who we are as individuals. Now, unfortunately, Christianity has come along and has decreed, because of its ties with civil governments and colonial governments, etc., that sex and sexuality, or sex, is a forbidden. Sex is essential to who we are as humans. It is vital. And one of the things that I know that we have run away from, or we've escaped, or allowed ourselves to be deluded by, is the fact that at the bottom level, ladies and gentlemen, we are all still part of that animal kingdom, aren't we? Therefore, we are driven just as much by sex and our sex. It is one of the strongest motivating forces in us. It propels us. It commands us. It makes us do things sometimes that we would rather not do, or we would regret later on because we are driven. So for example, I really don't care how old you are, whether you're gay or straight, how many people would get up at 2 o'clock in the morning out in a -4-degree wind chill, jump on the subway to go to somebody's house for a hookup? Okay? That sexual drive But deeper than that is that the act of engaging in sex with someone else is an act of connectivity. It is an act of connection. It is an act of bonding. Because none of us lives in a vacuum. None of us lives alone. Some of us may in apartments by ourselves like I do, but hey, that's between me and my hands. But seriously, from the minute we are born, we begin to form bonds that are crucial to our very existence. As Dr. Hodge was saying, that self-esteem that we have or lack is important because we start to set those bonds up early, and how we are validated, how we are accepted, contributes to that development of self-esteem. Make sense? Certainly too, for men, we have been expected to place a lot of emphasis on how we perform. So, yes, when we go to the public urinal, and we will look over to see how big the other person's dick is as compared to ours. We do it. Well, that's all right, but somebody else might be looking at yours. And there's a reason, and listen, it is not necessarily to suggest that somebody looking over at you is homosexual. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the reason we do that is very primal. We look to see if the other person is likely to be competition for us. Because we're all striving to see the next woman we can get with. That's primal for us. That is our sex. Okay, it's natural that we do this. But when we talk about sexuality, and this is where sex transfers over into sexuality. Alfred Kinsey, the famous psychologist back in the 1950s, suggested that human sexuality for men is along a spectrum from 0 to 6. With 0 being completely heterosexual and 6 being homosexual. But here's the interesting part about this in our sexual development. That along that spectrum, men move from 0 to 2 to 3 to 4, 5, and 6. Very often, some men move 0 to 3 and move back to 2. And when is it that men try to figure out their sexuality? At what point in your sexual development does a man try to figure out his sexuality? Thank you. Around about puberty going into adolescence. When he goes to the bathroom and he sees a little bit of froth in his urine, and he wakes up every morning and he has an erection and he doesn't know what to do until he wakes up one morning and there's a wet spot and he gets scared. What is this? How did this come here? Or he discovers the pleasures of masturbation while in the shower or in his bed, and it's like the best joy he's ever had. He can't stop. 2 or 3 times a day, 4 times maybe more. But one of the interesting things about that development is that there are some people who exploit that. And that's a window in that sexual development. That's a window in vulnerability in a man's life. That's a time in a man's life when he's coming to understand and to know and to find out his role, what it means to be a man, how does he fit in with other men. And there are occasions when people take advantage and exploit that window of vulnerability. And can you, anybody give me an idea what happens in that, what typically or sometimes happens in that window of vulnerability?
Molestation.
Thank you. But also understand one thing too, that someone who is sexually molested or the molester are not necessarily gay. I need you to understand that. It does not follow, it does not mean that the person who molests a same-sex other person is gay or lesbian. I'll just divert and talk a little bit about sexual abuse. Is that it should be also understood and that sexual abuse follows along the same, follows parallel to what happens in domestic violence. Sexual abuse is like domestic violence. It is a form of domestic violence. But if, for example, a child sees continually that his father beats up on his mother, or his mother beats up on his father, that child then interprets that that is normal behavior. So then when that child gets a girlfriend, he will beat up on the girlfriend because that's all he knows. Similarly, when a man sexually abuses a young boy, it is possible that he himself was sexually abused as a child. And the sexual abuse of a child creates an entire neurological rewiring of that child's body. So that child grows up to think that sexually abusing another child at that age is normal behavior. That their bodies respond to that naturally, normally, without even realizing it. But that is not what our society says is normal. And interestingly enough, through talk therapy, a person who's been sexually abused can have their entire neurology rewired. Because the brain is capable of a process that's called neurogenesis, or neuroplasticity, where the brain creates new pathways. And so a person who was sexually abused through talk therapy over a period of time can learn to overcome and to be able to see life through the lens instead of this shadow lens that they've been seeing life all the time. So let's come back now to sexuality. Sexuality for a man, as I said, along the Kinsey scale, because there were a few people recently in the last 2 years who were trying to discredit and disprove Alfred Kinsey's spectrum of human sexuality. What is bisexual? What is heterosexual? What is homosexual? What is pansexual? What is metrosexual? These are all classifications and terms that we throw out and we use. But again, you remember I talked about us being primitive, us being fundamental, because we do that to separate, to divide, to segregate, to parse, to categorize for our own comfort. So we create these labels and put people in these boxes. Okay? It is important, I believe, that when we talk about sexuality, that we realize that sexuality is a spectrum. That human sexuality is not confined to one specific, to a binary gender definition of male and female. In the Dominican Republic, for example, in certain villages in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, there have been known to be what is called in the Dominican Republic the guevadoches, okay, which are children who are born, but at time of birth, their sex was indeterminate. The testes if they were going to be boy, had not descended. So what did the parents do? Dress and treat that child as a girl. But then some of them, the testes descend about 10, 11, 12, and they switch over and start dressing the child as a boy. Now, there are some, in some cultures as well, it's also in Africa, in some African villages, that this exists. And they don't have a problem with it, because it's a natural cultural shift. You understand? However, if we start talking about intersex, which is also along that spectrum of sexuality, if we start talking about intersex, we're talking about those people who find themselves not one gender or the other, that they feel comfortable in themselves being in between. We've got a problem, well, in many communities, there still is the culture and the stigma about transgender. But do people really understand what it means to be transgender? It means that there is an individual who was born in one gender, who grew up and was made to conform to that gender, but inside the person did not feel that this is who I am. And then when they had the opportunity, they wanted to transition to another gender. Our society is beginning to allow and recognize that. Our society today, in some senses, is moving along greater acceptance of sexuality on the human spectrum. But there are still some pockets in our society, racial pockets, ethnic pockets, that hold fast and maintain. A lot of our conversation on sex and sexuality is also predicated on what we were told and what we were taught by white colonialists, those from the Caribbean or even here in the United States, who have used religion and the church to tell us how we should live. But and you know what is interesting is there was just the Episcopal or Anglican Synod in the UK. And the African Anglican churches, or Episcopal churches, said that the American Episcopal Church is to be cut off from the Anglican Union, because the United States Episcopal Church agreed to have same-sex marriages and agreed to have gay bishops and priests in the church. The African church said that is unchristian. That is not what God intended. Contradicting the fact that the Anglican Church in Africa is a white British colonial imposition. That in fact, if you go back and you look at some of the early African cultures and tribes, that the spectrum of sexuality was well accepted. There is a book called The Greatest Taboo that talks about sex and sexuality in Africa. There's another book that is called, there's another book that talks about boy wives and female husbands, that talks about homosexuality and sexuality in Africa, that they exist in cultures and villages. There's a story of the king of Uganda, who in 1869 slaughtered 70 of his pages because the white French fathers and the Muslims had come and tried to influence him and tried to make him change. He was gay. He used to have sex with his pages. But these white men came in and said, no, this is not right, and tried to change them and turned his own people against him. And he killed them. Pope Pius came afterwards and canonized those pages as the Uganda martyrs. Well, John, who was it? Francis, I think, went and made them saints. Completely anti-cultural, completely against what has been who we are. But now, just quickly wrapping up here, I wanted to point out that if we're talking about sex and sexuality, how we understand that determines how we live our lives, determines how we interact with each other. It determines our mental state, for example. Because if you're not comfortable with who you are, then that will reflect on your relationships with others. Any questions? Dead silence. Hold it for later on. That was my. Thank you. All right, so thank you all very much.